Welcome to Market Mind Lab. Imagine it's the year 2000. A tiny, struggling startup walks into a boardroom and offers to sell themselves to a $6 billion empire for $50 million. The empire's CEO, he literally laughed them out of the room. Well, fast forward 10 years, and that seemingly untouchable retail giant was completely bankrupt, while the tiny startup they laughed at had morphed into a behemoth worth billions. Today, we're conducting a psychological autopsy on arguably the most famous failure in business history. In this explainer, we're going to dig deep into the hidden psychology, the massive cognitive biases, and the catastrophic human decisions that absolutely destroyed Blockbuster.
$50 million. I mean, today, that feels like absolute pocket change for what Netflix is worth, right? But when Reed Hastings offered his company to Blockbuster for that exact amount, Blockbuster just saw Netflix as this little gnat buzzing around a massive elephant. So, how does a team of brilliant, highly paid executives miscalculate that spectacularly? Well, to figure that out, we have to look way past the spreadsheets. We need to examine the human behavior and the psychological traps that were buried deep inside Blockbuster's business model.
Which brings us to part 1, the bad profits trap.
Back in the 1990s, going to Blockbuster wasn't just shopping. It was a total cultural ritual. You know the feeling, right? Walking through those iconic blue and yellow doors on a Friday night, it felt like a permanent fixture of modern life. But underneath those bright fluorescent lights, their massive success was built on a really dangerous vulnerability. Check this out. Nearly 16% of the empire's total revenue came from one specific thing: late fees. That is a staggering $800 million a year. Let that sink in. Almost $1 billion of their revenue was generated strictly by penalizing their own loyal customers.
And this introduces a really crucial concept in business psychology. It's called bad profits. Basically, this is revenue you generate by punishing customers who feel like they have absolutely no other choice. And what does that do? It creates this deep, hidden resentment. Blockbuster customers absolutely hated feeling nickel and dimed. Sure, they paid the fees, but quietly, a massive amount of latent market resentment was just building up and boiling over. Blockbuster was essentially getting paid to make their own customers angry. And all that frustration, it was just sitting there, waiting for a frictionless alternative to arrive.
This leads us straight into our second section, the status quo bias. Okay, so it's September 2000. Reed Hastings flies to Dallas to propose a partnership to Blockbuster's CEO, John Antioco. Hastings wasn't just offering a standard business deal here. Psychologically speaking, he was offering Blockbuster a lifeline, a way out of their bad profits trap. Blockbuster saw themselves as this untouchable retail ritual, right? While Netflix represented a frictionless digital future. But Antioco suffered from a massive failure of empathy. He looked at Netflix, which at the time was just a niche service actively losing money sending DVDs through the mail, and he completely ignored the underlying consumer desire for that frictionless digital future. Antioco was totally blinded by what psychologists call the status quo bias. It's this cognitive rigidity where leaders believe their current successful systems are just untouchable. Because Blockbuster was winning today, Antioco just couldn't fathom a tomorrow where they weren't. He dismissed the evolving alternative and literally laughed Hastings right out of his office. What he completely missed was a fundamental rule of human behavior. Once consumers experience a task without friction, they are never going back.
Let's move on to Section 3, the innovator's dilemma. So, Blockbuster's refusal wasn't just some math mistake. It was a complete failure to understand what people actually wanted. See, Netflix had flipped the emotional script. By removing late fees entirely, they shifted the whole consumer experience from punishment to reward. Plus, they were building this powerful, data-driven growth flywheel that actually learned what people wanted to watch. Meanwhile, Blockbuster was paralyzed by the innovator's dilemma. That's the terrifying fear that building an innovative future is going to cannibalize your highly profitable past. They were addicted to the friction of late fees because, well, that friction paid the bills. They just couldn't bring themselves to build an online future if it meant destroying that incredibly profitable, yet universally hated, revenue stream. You can really see this play out in their delayed reaction. In 2000, they refused that Dallas meeting. It wasn't until 4 years later, in 2004, that Antioco finally woke up to the threat and launched Blockbuster Online. Then, in 2006, they introduced a genuinely brilliant counterattack called Total Access, which let online customers return movies right to the physical stores. It was a blended model, and it actually worked beautifully. Former Netflix execs even admitted this move slowed their growth and almost knocked them out. But then came 2007, and with it, complete boardroom panic. See, this digital expansion cost Blockbuster $200 million in lost late fees, plus another $200 million to actually build the online system. Their short-term profitability tanked, and the board completely lost its nerve. Which brings us to Section 4, the psychological civil war.
This is the exact moment where the story pivots from a strategic business failure directly into a toxic psychological civil war led by activist investor Carl Icahn. It is a masterclass in how human incentives can absolutely destroy a company. First, the board panics over the short-term loss of those late fees. Next, incentive bias takes over. These executives and board members were paid based on quarterly performance bonuses, so to them, long-term innovation just looks like a terrifying liability. Driven by this toxic dispute over compensation, Antioco, the very retail genius who had just built the digital model that almost saved them, was pushed out. And finally, the plug was pulled entirely on their digital future.
Antioco was replaced by Jim Keyes, a former 7-Eleven executive, and his hubris was just staggering. He famously stated, "Netflix does nothing Blockbuster can't do." In a fatal move designed entirely to save cash and boost short-term quarterly profits, Keyes abandoned the digital strategy and literally pivoted the company backward. He went back to focusing on physical stores, trying to push sales of gum and candy at the register. He completely, fundamentally misunderstood the changing dynamics of the market. What Keyes and the board failed to grasp is a psychological concept called the threshold model. This is a collective behavior concept where an idea starts in a niche, like, say, movie geeks renting DVDs by mail. But once it reaches a critical mass of early adopters, it triggers this unstoppable viral cascade. Blockbuster thought they had time. They thought they could just retreat to retail and return to digital later on. But by the time they tried to jump back into the digital race, Netflix's viral cascade had already crossed the point of no return. And compounding all of these disastrous psychological decisions was one staggering reality. Blockbuster was crushed beneath $1 billion in debt from their spin-off from Viacom. Because of the internal sabotage, the hubris, and this massive pile of debt, they had absolutely zero financial slack left. So when the 2008 recession hit, the elephant began to bleed out rapidly. And that little gnat they laughed at, it had finally become an unstoppable giant. Let's wrap things up with Section 5, Lessons in Strategic Agility. By 2010, the once $6 billion empire officially filed for bankruptcy, leaving exactly one nostalgic store still operating today in Bend, Oregon. But this psychological autopsy leaves us with 3 absolutely critical insights. First, you must never rely on bad profits that punish your customers. Resentment is a silent killer. It just waits patiently for a competitor to offer your customers a better way. Second, agility beats size every single time. Blockbuster was a massive, well-oiled machine, but cognitive rigidity and boardroom panic made them way too slow to adapt. And third, you have to conquer the innovator's dilemma. If you aren't willing to kill your own successful cash cow to build the future, I promise you, a competitor will happily do it for you. Blockbuster had the money, they had the massive brand recognition, and they had the perfect chance to completely own the digital era. But because of fear, incentive bias, and hubris, they chose to protect a fading past instead. So I want to leave you with this final thought. Look at your own life or your own business. Are you making a decision because it's right for the future, or are you just afraid of losing what you have today? Take a moment to really think about that and let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for joining us on Market Mind Lab for this explainer, and we'll see you next time.